The third eye burned. Stephen Strange sat cross-legged in the Sanctum Sanctorum, surrounded by candles, whose flames refused to flicker despite the draft creeping through the ancient windows. His hands rested on his knees, scarred fingers trembling with the effort of maintaining the meditation pose. The eye of Agamotto lay dormant against his chest, but the other eye, the one that had opened on his forehead after he had violated every principle he once held. Sacred pulsed with a rhythm that belonged to no heartbeat, he recognized. He had been trying to contain it for weeks now. The Darkhold had left its mark deeper than flesh, deeper than bone. It had carved itself into the fabric of his being. And now that fabric was beginning to fray. The eye twitched. Once. Twice. A spasm of sensation that felt like someone pressing their thumb against the back of his skull from the inside. Strange exhaled slowly, reaching for the techniques the Ancient One had taught him. Center the self. Acknowledge the pain. Let it pass through without attachment. But the eye did not care for Buddhist philosophy or mystic discipline. It had tasted knowledge that predated both, and it wanted more. The frequency changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the underlying hum of magical energy that permeated the sanctum. Strange had lived in this building long enough to know its rhythms as intimately as his own pulse. Every ward, every protective spell, every dimensional anchor sang its own note in the symphony of defensive magic that kept the building standing between worlds. But now, one of those notes had gone sharp, then flat, then warped into something that made his teeth ache. He opened his eyes. The candle flames were bending toward the east wall, all of them, as if gravity had tilted 30 degrees and forgotten to inform the rest of reality. Strange rose to his feet, his hands already weaving the diagnostic patterns he had learned in his first month at Camartage. Golden light traced geometric shapes in the air, each one designed to measure and map the flow of mystical energy. The results made no sense. The dimensional barriers were intact. The protective wards remained unbroken. Yet something was pulling at the space itself, tugging at the invisible threads that held this slice of reality together. The third eye convulsed, and Strange staggered. Pain lanced through his skull, white-hot and immediate, but beneath the pain was something else. Recognition. The eye knew this sensation, this frequency. It had felt it before in a place that existed between dreams and damnation. The Darkhold, but he had destroyed the Darkhold. Wanda had destroyed every copy across the multiverse, burning them all away in her final act of redemption. Strange had watched the book in his own hands crumble to ash, had felt the psychic severing as that dark connection was cut. So why did the eye still remember? The east wall began to shimmer. Strange moved on instinct, his hands snapping forward to weave a containment spell. But the magic dissolved before it could take form. Whatever was happening, it was not happening in this dimension alone. He could feel the layers peeling back reality, unfurling like a flower made of razors, and at the center of it all was a darkness that had no name in any earth language. The shimmer became a tear. The tear became a wound. And through the wound poured a light that was not light at all, but rather the absence of light, given form and malice. It was purple and black, and somehow both colors at once swirling with patterns that hurt to perceive directly. Strange threw up a shield spell, the golden disk of energy manifesting between him and the breach. The knot light struck the shield and clung to it like oil, eating away at the magic with a patience that felt almost alive. He poured more energy into the shield, drawing from the sanctum's reserves, from his own considerable power. But it was like trying to dam a river with paper. The third eye screamed. There were no words in the scream, no articulated thought. But Strange understood it anyway. This was resonance. The corruption the Darkhold had left in him was calling out to something equally corrupted, equally ancient, and that something was answering with enthusiasm. The breach widened. Through it, Strange caught glimpses of somewhere else. A sky the color of bruised flesh. towers that twisted in directions that should not exist. And beneath it all, an ocean that seemed to be made of liquid shadow, its surface broken by structures that might have been buildings, or might have been the calcified bones of gods. He tried to close the breach, tried to sever the connection, to slam shut whatever door the third eye had inadvertently opened. But his magic could not find purchase. The breach existed in all dimensions simultaneously, and to close it in one would only open it wider in another. The pull began then, gentle at first, like a breeze tugging at his robes, but growing stronger with each passing second. Strange braced himself, one hand reaching out to grab the bookshelf beside him. But his fingers passed through the wood as if it were mist. He was already halfway out of phase with his own reality. He had time for one thought, sharp and bitter and entirely inappropriate given the circumstances. Great. Another cosmic bill I did not pay. Then the breach swallowed him whole. The sensation of falling through realities was not new to Strange. He had been thrown across dimensions by the Ancient One, had navigated the space between universes during the conflict with Thanos, had walked through the corpse of a dead universe to reach Wanda before it was too late. But this was different. Each reality he fell through was not simply another world, but another wound. Each one had been touched by the same corruption that now pulsed in his forehead, and each one reached out to him as he passed, trying to claim him as its own. He saw forests where the trees grew downward into an inverted sky, cities where the buildings breathed and bled, a sun that had been replaced by something that wore a sun's shape but possessed none of its warmth. And through it all, that voice. It did not speak in words. It did not need to. It pressed itself directly into his mind, bypassing language and reason to plant concepts like seeds in poisoned soil. Come, see, remember. Strange tried to resist, tried to assert his own will against the pull. But the third eye had already made its choice. It wanted to go where it was being called. It wanted to see what waited at the other end of this impossible journey. The fall ended without warning. One moment Strange was tumbling through the spaces between spaces, and the next he was lying face down on something solid. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent new pain shooting through his damaged hands. He lay there for a moment gasping, trying to orient himself, trying to remember which way was up. The ground beneath him was wrong. That was his first coherent thought. It was solid enough, but it felt organic, as if he were lying on skin rather than stone. He pushed himself up on his elbows and looked down. Black sand. Or something that resembled sand, if sand could be the color of oil slicks and shift constantly, even when nothing touched it. Each grain seemed to contain its own internal light, a faint purple luminescence that pulsed in time with his racing heart. Strange got to his feet, swaying slightly. His head throbbed where the third eye had finally gone dormant again, leaving behind the familiar ache of overuse. He was still wearing his robes, and the cloak of levitation still clung to his shoulders, though it trembled with something that might have been fear. He looked up. The sky was the color of deep water seen from below that particular shade of blue-green that existed only in the depths where light had given up trying to reach. But this was not water. Strange could feel the air moving across his face, could taste salt and something else, something mineral and ancient. The sky simply looked like water, as if reality here had decided that metaphor and substance were interchangeable concepts. Lightning flickered in that false ocean above purple and white, illuminating shapes that moved just beneath the surface. Shapes too large to be clouds, too purposeful in their movement to be natural phenomena. Strange turned slowly, taking in his surroundings. He stood on a beach that curved away in both directions, the black sand giving way to dark stone formations that rose like the vertebrae of some buried leviathan. The ocean before him was real enough, its waves lapping at the shore with a sound that was almost normal, almost comforting, except that each wave left behind a residue that glowed faintly before sinking into the sand. And beyond the ocean, perhaps a mile distant, Strange could see the city. It clung to the seafloor like a tumor, visible through water that was somehow transparent despite its depth. Towers and spires and structures that defied architectural logic, all of them built from materials that seemed to shift between stone and coral, and something that might have been crystallized, screaming. The city was vast, far larger than New York, and completely submerged. But it was not abandoned. Lights moved through the streets. Things that might have been inhabitants, though, Strange doubted they were human, went about their business with the casual indifference of those who had long since forgotten what the surface world looked like. And above the city, anchored to nothing, floated spheres of energy that pulsed with the same purple light as the sand beneath his feet. Strange recognized the architectural style. Not from his studies at Camartage, not from any of the mystical texts he had consumed in his hunger for knowledge. But he recognized it anyway because the third eye remembered. The Darkhold had shown him glimpses of places like this, civilizations that had reached too far and touched things that reached back. This was Natsyatar. He did not know how he knew, only that the name came to him with the same certainty as his own. This was a city that had fallen beneath the waves, and in falling had found something that most surface dwellers were blessed never to encounter. The arcane density here was staggering. Strange could feel it pressing against him like humidity so thick he could almost see it distorting the air. Every breath he took was laden with power, wild and unstructured, the kind of raw, magical energy that would have driven lesser practitioners mad within minutes. He needed to analyze this to understand where he was and how to get back. Strange raised his hands, preparing to cast a diagnostic spell when the water exploded. The thing that emerged from the ocean was not one creature, but many fused together into a configuration that mocked biology and sanity in equal measure. It had wings made of solidified shadow. It had eyes that burned with light stolen from dying stars. It had a body that seemed to be constructed from equal parts dragon demon and fever dream. All of it wrapped in flames that were somehow black flames that consumed light rather than produced it. The shadow flame entity hung in the air for a moment, water streaming from its impossible body. And then it screamed. The sound was not one that should have come from any throat, any vocal structure. It was the sound of reality itself being torn of the space between atoms, crying out in protest. Strange threw up a shield without thinking, the golden mandala of protective energy manifesting, just in time to deflect the first gout of black fire. The flame struck the shield and spread across it like liquid, eating away at the magic with a hunger that was almost sexual in its intensity. He reinforced the shield, pouring more power into it, but he could already see the cracks forming. This thing, whatever it was not simply strong. It was antithetical to the kind of magic Strange practiced. His power was structured, disciplined, built on centuries of accumulated knowledge and careful study. The entity's power was older Rar, a force that had existed before the first conscious mind had thought to give magic rules and limitations. The entity attacked again, this time with physical force rather than fire. One massive claw slammed into the shield, and Strange felt the impact reverberate through every bone in his body. The shield held but barely, and he knew it would not survive another strike like that. He needed a different approach. Strange dismissed the shield and rolled to the side, letting the cloak catch the air and carry him away from the entity's next attack. The black flame scorched the sand where he had been standing, turning it into glass that immediately cracked and shattered. He landed 20 feet away, his hands already weaving a different spell. Eldritch blades materialized in his grasp. Swords made of orange energy that hummed with barely contained violence. Strange had always preferred defensive magic, preferring to avoid killing when possible, but the Hippocratic Oath meant nothing to something that had never been alive in any conventional sense. He attacked, closing the distance between himself and the entity, with a speed that would have impressed his younger self. The blades cut into the creature's hide, parting shadow and flame. And for a moment, Strange felt a surge of hope. Then the wounds closed. Not healed, but closed, the entity's body flowing back together, like water disturbed and then made still again. The entity turned its attention fully on Strange now, and he saw something in those burning eyes that chilled him more than the black flames had. Intelligence. This was not some mindless beast. It was thinking, calculating, analyzing him the same way he was analyzing it. It spoke. The words were not in any language Strange recognized, but the third eye translated them automatically, the meaning bypassing his ears entirely and manifesting directly in his mind. Strange one. Broken one. Marked by the scripture that devours. Strange did not respond. He was too busy trying not to die. The entity attacked in earnest, now no longer testing him, no longer playing. It moved with a speed that should have been impossible for something its size, its body contorting in ways that made Strange's eyes water. Claws and fire and something else. Something that felt like frozen time and tasted like regret. All of it directed at the single fragile human who had dared to intrude on this desolate shore. Strange fought back with everything he had. Eldritch whips to bind the entity's limbs. Crimson bands to slow its movements. Mirror dimension portals to redirect its attacks back at itself. He drew on every trick he had learned, every technique he had mastered, and it was barely enough to keep him alive. The entity was not diminishing. If anything, it was growing stronger, feeding on the conflict itself, drinking in the magical energy being expended and converting it into fuel for its own impossible existence. Strange needed to change the battlefield. He opened a portal beneath the entity's feet, a gateway not to another place, but to another layer of reality. The mirror dimension, where the laws of physics were more suggestions than rules, where Strange could reshape the environment to his advantage. But the entity did not fall through. It grabbed the edges of the portal with its claws and tore it wider, ripping a hole in the dimensional barrier that sent feedback screaming back through Strange's nervous system. He staggered, vision blurring, and barely managed to close the portal before it could tear the fabric of space completely. The entity laughed. The sound was wet and crackling like meat on a fire. Strange retreated the cloak, carrying him across the black sand toward the stone formations. His mind raced, analyzing possibilities, discarding failed strategies, searching for anything that might give him an edge. The ocean. The thermal vents he had glimpsed beneath the waves during his initial scan of the area. The entity was made of shadow and flame, but fire, even black fire, still required fuel and oxygen. Water and superheated pressure might not kill it, but they could contain it long enough for Strange to escape. He stopped retreating and turned to face the entity, his hands moving through a complex series of gestures. This spell was not from the standard Kamar-Taj curriculum. It was something he had developed himself, combining principles from thermodynamics with mystical energy manipulation, a piece of hybrid magic that belonged equally to science and sorcery. The ocean responded. A column of water rose from the depths, carrying with it heat and pressure from the thermal vents far below. Strange shaped it, guided it, turned it into a weapon that crashed into the entity with the force of a small earthquake. Steam exploded outward, scalding and blinding, and for a moment, Strange could not see anything. When the steam cleared, the entity was gone. Strange did not relax. He kept his guard up, scanning the beach, the sky, the water, waiting for the inevitable counterattack. But seconds passed, then minutes, and nothing emerged. He had not killed it. Strange was certain of that. At best, he had forced it to retreat, had convinced it that consuming him was more trouble than it was worth. But it was gone for now, and that was enough. Strange stood alone on the black sand, breathing hard, his body trembling with exhaustion. The third eye pulsed once, a reminder of its presence, and then fell silent. The voice came from beneath the waves. It did not shout. It did not need to. It simply spoke, and the ocean carried its words to shore with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. You carry the mark of forbidden scripture. Your reality, the small one you call home. It has a taste most intriguing. We would know more of it. We would drink deep of its dreams and feast upon its endings. Strange said nothing. His throat was dry, his hands still shaking from the fight, but he kept his expression neutral. He had learned long ago not to show fear to entities that fed on it. The voice continued unhurried, almost gentle. You cannot leave marked one. The door that brought you here has closed, and you lack the strength to open it again. But we are not without mercy. Serve us, show us the path to your fragile world. And in return, we shall give you what you most desire. Strange found his voice then rough and hoarse but steady. What makes you think you know what I desire? The ocean did not answer. Not in words. Instead, the water at the shore began to glow purple light, rising from the depths like a second sun. And in that light, Strange saw shapes forming. Memories given substance pulled from his mind without permission and displayed for his torment. A frozen lake. A small girl falling through the ice. And a boy who was not yet a doctor, who was not yet a sorcerer, who was nothing but helpless as he watched his sister drown. Donna. The voice spoke one final time before retreating back into the depths. We know everything, Stephen Strange. We see all that you have lost, all that you failed to save. And we can give it back if you but open the door. Then the light faded, and Strange was alone once more on the shore of a city that should not exist in a world that was not his own, with a wound in his forehead that burned like a brand. He sank to his knees in the black sand and allowed himself just for a moment to close his eyes. Strange did not know how long he knelt on that beach. Time felt negotiable here, as if the universe had not yet decided whether seconds should pass quickly or slowly, and so had chosen to do both simultaneously. His body told him it had been hours. His mind insisted it had been mere minutes. The third eye, mercifully dormant, now offered no opinion. Eventually, the cold drove him to his feet. The air here carried a chill that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the wrongness of the place. It seeped through his robes, through his skin, settling into his bones, with the patient malice of something that knew he had nowhere else to go. He needed to understand where he was. More importantly, he needed to understand how to leave. Strange closed his eyes and reached out with his senses, not the physical ones, but the others, the ones he had spent years training to perceive the flows and eddies of mystical energy. The Sanctum Sanctorum had taught him to read the magical signature of a place the way a sailor reads the ocean, understanding its moods and dangers through subtle signs, invisible to the untrained eye. What he felt here made no sense. The arcane density was overwhelming, yes, but that alone was not unusual. He had visited dimensions where magic was so thick it formed visible clouds in the air. What disturbed him was the structure of it. The energy here was not chaotic or wild, despite the presence of the void corruption. It was ordered, deliberate, built, according to principles that were simultaneously alien and hauntingly familiar. Underneath the void's taint, underneath the whispers and the corruption, there was engineering. Someone or something had shaped the magical substrate of this world with the same care and precision that Tony Stark had applied to his armor. This was not a naturally occurring phenomenon. This was construction on a scale that made the Sanctum's protections look like a child's sandbox. And the source of that construction was calling to him. Strange felt it as a pull gentle but insistent, coming from somewhere far to the north. It reminded him of the way certain power centers in his own universe resonated with trained practitioners, how a sufficiently skilled sorcerer could sense the presence of Kamartaj from half a world away. But this was stronger, cleaner, untouched by the corruption that seeped through everything else in this desolate place. He had a choice. He could stay here on this beach, waiting for the voice beneath the waves to return with more torments and temptations. Or he could follow the pull and hope that whatever waited at its source might provide answers or at least a way home. Strange opened a portal. The familiar golden sparks traced their circle in the air, and for a moment relief flooded through him. If he could still access the dimensional pathways, still manipulate space in the ways Kamartaj had taught him, then perhaps the voice had been lying. Perhaps he could find his own way back to Earth without needing to bargain with entities that wore other people's memories like weapons. But when the portal stabilized, Strange found himself looking not at the New York sanctum, or even at some neutral dimensional crossroads, but at a mountainside so vast and impossibly carved that it made his breath catch in his throat. He stepped through. The cold here was immediate and brutal. The kind of cold that existed at altitudes where the air itself had given up pretending to be breathable. Snow crunched beneath his feet, and the cloak pulled itself tighter around his shoulders, trying and failing to provide adequate warmth. Strange wrapped his arms around himself and looked up at what his portal had brought him to. The mountain before him was not a mountain at all. It was a structure, a facility, a complex so enormous that it had been carved into and through an entire peak. Towers rose from the stone like the fingers of a buried giant, reaching for a sky it could no longer see. Walkways and bridges connected impossible spans, defying gravity and geometry with the casual arrogance of beings who had mastered both. And everywhere, there were lights. Blue, white, and cold, they pulsed with a steady rhythm that reminded Strange uncomfortably of a heartbeat. Okay, Tony would have killed to see this. The thought came unbidden, sharp with grief, that Strange had learned to carry, but never quite learned to set down. Stark would have loved this place, would have spent days analyzing its construction, reverse engineering its principles, probably trying to build his own version back home. Strange allowed himself a moment to imagine that conversation, that partnership before pushing the thought away. Stark was gone. The universe had demanded his sacrifice, and Strange had made certain that sacrifice meant something. But standing here looking at architecture that made Earth's greatest achievements look like cave paintings, Strange felt the weight of that loss more keenly than he had in months. He started walking. The pathways were wide enough to accommodate something much larger than a human, and the steps were spaced at intervals that suggested whoever built this place had legs at least twice as long as his own. Strange climbed anyway, his damaged hands gripping railings carved from stone that felt more like metal, cold and smooth and utterly unyielding. The higher he climbed, the stronger the pull became. It was no longer simply calling to him. It was aware of him, tracking his approach with the patient attention of something that had all the time in the world and no reason to hurry. Strange reached a plaza, a flat expanse of carved stone that stretched for what must have been a quarter-mile in every direction. At its center stood a door massive and sealed, covered in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. They were not simply decorative. They were functional part of some containment or protection system, so advanced that Strange could not begin to parse its operation. He approached the door carefully, hands raised ready to defend himself if this turned out to be another trap. But nothing attacked, nothing emerged. The door simply stood there, and the pull that had drawn him here intensified until it felt like a hand pressed against his chest, gently but firmly, preventing him from coming any closer. Then the door opened. Light poured out, not the warm gold of Earth's sun, but something colder, more sterile. The light of distant stars filtered through instruments designed to measure rather than illuminate. And in that light, something descended. It was humanoid, in the way that a statue is humanoid, possessing the correct number of limbs and features, but arranged with such perfect symmetry that it crossed from beauty into something almost threatening. Its skin, if it could be called skin, appeared to be made of the same material as the stars themselves, constantly shifting between solid matter and pure energy. It wore robes that seemed to be woven from constellations, and its eyes held the cold calculation of a being that had watched civilizations rise and fall with the same dispassion a human might observe bacteria in a petri dish. The entity regarded Strange for a long moment, its gaze stripping away pretense and defense until he felt exposed in a way that went far beyond physical nakedness. When it finally spoke, its voice carried harmonics that Strange's ears should not have been able to process, layers of meaning, stacked upon meaning until the simple words contained entire philosophical treatises. "You are not of this world." Strange straightened, forcing himself to meet those impossible eyes. "No, I am not." The entity tilted its head, a gesture so perfectly calculated to appear curious that it somehow became more alien rather than less. "You are an aberration. Your presence here creates dissonance in the fundamental structure of reality. The harmonic frequencies of your dimensional origin do not align with the substrate of this world. You are in all measurable ways a contaminant." Strange had been called many things in his life, both before and after his transformation into a sorcerer. Arrogant, reckless, brilliant, dangerous. But contaminant was new. I did not choose to come here. Something pulled me through. A breach between realities that I did not create and could not control. The entity's expression, if it could be called an expression, did not change. Irrelevant. Intent does not alter consequence. You exist where you should not exist. The probability matrix of this world has been disrupted by your presence. Timelines that should remain discrete are now bleeding into one another. The Titans foresaw many potential futures for AzeRoth, but none of them included you, AzeRoth. So that was the name of this world. Strange filed the information away, along with the mention of Titans. The entity before him clearly considered itself part of that category, or at least a servant of beings who held that title. "Then help me leave. If my presence here is so disruptive, surely it is in everyone's best interest for me to return to my own reality." The entity said nothing for a long moment. When it finally responded, its tone had shifted in a way Strange could not quite define. It was still cold, still analytical. But there was something underneath now, some additional layer of calculation that made the hair on the back of Strange's neck stand up. "You misunderstand. The disruption you cause is not simply your presence. It is what you carry within you." The entity raised one hand, and suddenly Strange could not move. Not paralyzed, not bound by any visible force, but simply locked in place, as if the universe itself had decided that his body should occupy this exact position and no other. The entity approached, moving with a grace that was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, until it stood close enough that Strange could see his own reflection in those star-filled eyes. The mark of forbidden knowledge, the corruption of texts that predate mortal understanding. You have touched something that should not be touched. Learned secrets that were meant to remain hidden. The damage to your personal reality matrix is extensive. Terminal by some measurements. The third eye burned. Strange tried to speak to protest, but his jaw would not move. The entity reached out with one finger and touched the center of Strange's forehead, just above where the cursed third eye had opened. The sensation was indescribable. It was every medical examination Strange had ever performed or endured, condensed into a single instant of absolute violation. The entity was reading him, analyzing him, dissecting his entire existence down to the quantum level, and cataloging the results with mechanical precision. Then the entity withdrew, and Strange could move again. He stumbled backward, gasping, one hand pressed to his forehead where the touch had left a sensation like frostbite. Fascinating. You are aware of the corruption. You fight against it even as it reshapes you from within. Most beings touched by such darkness surrender to it or are consumed. You do neither. You endure. The entity paused, and for the first time since their encounter began, it seemed uncertain. This complicates matters. Strange found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "Who are you?" "I am Algalon. I am the herald of the Titans. I observe, I analyze, I report, and when necessary, I execute the will of those who shape this world from formless void." My function is to monitor AzeRoth for signs of critical corruption. And should such corruption reach irreversible levels, to initiate the process of planetary reorigination. Strange felt his blood go cold. Reorigination. The term was clinical antiseptic, but its meaning was clear enough. This being was describing genocide on a planetary scale dressed up in the language of quality control. You would destroy an entire world. Algalon's expression remained unchanged. I would reset it, remove the corruption, return it to base parameters so that it might be reshaped according to proper specifications. The Titans do not create lightly, and they do not tolerate their works being perverted beyond redemption. And you think I am part of that corruption, that my presence here justifies that kind of response. I think you are an anomaly that exists outside my operational parameters. You are not of AzeRoth, yet you carry within you a darkness that resonates with the deepest corruption this world has ever known. The old gods. The entities that the Titans imprisoned beneath the surface of this world, they whisper to you. I can see their influence in the structure of your thoughts. They have marked you as their own. Strange wanted to deny it, to argue that the Darkhold had nothing to do with whatever old gods Algalon was referring to, that the corruption in him came from an entirely different source. But he could not. The third eye pulsed in agreement, acknowledging a kinship that Strange desperately wanted to reject. So what happens now? You have evaluated me, found me wanting. Are you going to remove me from your perfect world? Algalon tilted his head again, that same calculated gesture of inquiry. I am uncertain. Your presence here is unauthorized, your existence a threat to dimensional stability. Protocol suggests immediate containment and removal. However, you also represent a unique data point. An entity from beyond AzeRoth, who has been touched by forces similar to those that plague this world. Studying you may provide insights into combating the very corruption you carry. Strange felt a cold smile touch his lips. So you are not sure whether to kill me or vivisect me? How reassuring. I do not kill. I correct. There is a difference. Not from where I am standing. Algalon stared at him for a long moment. And Strange had the uncomfortable sensation of being weighed on scales he could not see measured against standards he did not understand. Then the entity moved. It was not an attack, not exactly, but it was an assertion of power so absolute that it might as well have been. Algalon raised both hands, and reality around Strange began to shift. Not the reality of the physical world, but something deeper, the underlying code that determined what was real and what was not. Strange felt himself being isolated, separated from the dimensional substrate, the way a surgeon might excise a tumor from healthy tissue. He fought back on instinct. Shields manifested around him, layers of protective magic drawn from every tradition he had studied. The crimson bands of Sitarak, the shields of the Seraphim, geometries from the mirror dimension twisted into configuration concealment that should not be possible. Strange threw everything he had into maintaining his connection to reality, refusing to let this cosmic bureaucrat edit him out of existence. Algalon paused, and something that might have been surprise flickered across his perfect features. You resist. Interesting. Most beings cannot even perceive what I am doing, let alone counter it. Strange's hands moved in patterns too complex for the untrained eye to follow, weaving spells and counterspells, bending the space around him into a fortress of pure will. I have spent years learning to bend reality to my will. I have bargained with entities that make you look like a civil servant. I have died and returned more times than I can count. You will not find me easy to erase. Algalon increased the pressure. The isolation effect intensified, and Strange felt his defenses beginning to buckle. He was strong, perhaps the strongest human sorcerer Earth had ever produced, but Algalon was operating on a level beyond mere magic. This was cosmic engineering, the manipulation of fundamental universal constants, and Strange simply did not have the tools to counter it directly. So he stopped trying. Instead of fighting the isolation effect, Strange redirected it. He curved the space around himself, bending the dimensions the way a lens bends light, and sent Algalon's attack sliding past him rather than through him. It was not a permanent solution, barely even a temporary one, but it bought him a few precious seconds. Algalon stopped. The pressure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, and Strange nearly collapsed from the abrupt absence of resistance. He caught himself, forced his body to remain upright, and met Algalon's gaze with as much defiance as he could muster. The entity regarded him with something that might have been respect, though it was difficult to tell with a being whose face seemed designed to convey calculation rather than emotion. You are resourceful, adaptable, and despite the corruption you carry, you retain sufficient will to resist external manipulation. These are not common traits, or not. Algalon lowered his hands, and the threat immediate and crushing receded. I will not attempt to remove you again. Not yet. You have earned a reprieve through your resistance, and I am curious to see what role you will play in the events to come. However, know this Stephen Strange of Earth. Your presence here is a wound in reality. Every moment you remain, that wound deepens. The old gods beneath the ocean can feel you, taste you, and they hunger for what you represent. A bridge between worlds, a door that opens both ways. Strange's hands were shaking. He could not tell if it was from exhaustion or fear or rage. I did not ask for any of this. Algalon turned away back toward the massive door from which he had emerged. Few do. Fate is rarely concerned with permission. Wait. Algalon paused but did not turn. If you are not going to help me leave, at least tell me what I am dealing with. These old gods you mentioned. What are they? Now Algalon did turn, and for the first time since their encounter began, Strange saw something in those eyes that looked almost like pity. They are hunger given consciousness, corruption given purpose. They are the mistakes the Titans made when they tried to bring order to a world that was never meant to be ordered, and they are very, very interested in you. Then the Herald of the Titans stepped back through his door, and the light went out, and Strange was left alone on the plaza with the cold wind and the weight of knowledge he had not wanted. He understood now why the voice beneath the waves had been so confident, why it had not bothered to pursue him when he had fled the beach. It did not need to chase him. In this world surrounded by forces that wanted to either consume him or erase him, with no clear path home and a corruption in his soul that marked him as prey to beings older than human civilization, Strange had nowhere to run. The third eye pulsed, once a reminder of the bond he shared with the darkness below, and Strange pressed his hand against his forehead, as if he could somehow push the cursed thing back inside. He had faced gods before, had bargained with Dormammu, had fought Thanos, had walked through the corpse of a dead universe, and emerged intact. But standing here on a world that was not his own, marked by powers he barely understood, Strange felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. He felt afraid. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of salt, and something else, something that tasted like old promises and forgotten names. Strange pulled his cloak tighter around himself and began the long walk back down the mountain. He needed to find shelter, needed to rest and recover and think. Because Algalon was right about one thing. Strange's presence here was a wound, and wounds had a way of attracting things that fed on blood. The question was not whether those things would find him. The question was what he would do when they did. Strange found shelter in the ruins of what might have once been a watchtower or perhaps a shrine. It was difficult to tell. The structure clung to the mountainside like a barnacle, half collapsed and covered in ice that glowed faintly purple in the darkness. The glow bothered him more than the cold did. It suggested that even here, miles from the ocean and the voice that waited beneath it, the corruption was present, patient, seeping into everything, like water through cracks in stone. He sat with his back against a wall that felt more organic than it should have, his hands tucked into his armpits for warmth, and tried to think. The situation was worse than he had initially assessed. Much worse. He He was trapped in a world where the cosmic guardians considered him a contaminant to be eliminated, and the entities imprisoned beneath the surface considered him a doorway to be exploited. Both sides possessed power on scales that made most of Earth's threats look like playground disputes, and neither side seemed particularly interested in his opinions on the matter. The third eye throbbed a steady pulse that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Strange pressed his fingers against it, applying pressure as if he could somehow push it back into dormancy through sheer force of will. It did not work. It never worked. The eye was part of him now, woven into his being at a level too fundamental to simply excise. He had tried in the weeks after Wanda had destroyed the Darkhold. Had spent hours in front of mirrors examining the cursed thing, analyzing its structure with every diagnostic spell he knew. But removing it would require removing pieces of his consciousness itself, cutting away parts of his mind that had been irreversibly altered by his contact with forbidden knowledge. He would survive the procedure technically, but what remained would not be Stephen Strange. It would be something less. Something broken in ways that even magic could not repair. So he had learned to live with it instead. Learned to manage the constant low-grade pain, the occasional flashes of insight that came from places he did not want to access. The sense that something behind his eyes was always watching, always waiting for him to make a mistake large enough to exploit. But here in this world, saturated with the same kind of corruption that had created the eye in the first place, management was becoming increasingly difficult. Strange could feel the void calling to him, not with words, but with sensation. It pressed against the boundaries of his mind like water against a dam, testing for weaknesses, probing for cracks. And the worst part, the part that terrified him more than Algalon's threats or the Shadow Flame entity's hunger, was that the pressure felt familiar, comfortable even. Like coming home after a long journey to find that home had been waiting patiently for his return. He needed to understand what he was dealing with. Needed to analyze the void's signature map, its structure, find its weaknesses. Strange had not become the Sorcerer Supreme by running from threats. He had become the Sorcerer Supreme by studying them, dissecting them, learning their rules, and then finding ways to break those rules in his favor. The ocean was where the answers waited. Strange had known that since the moment the voice had spoken to him on the beach, had felt the certainty of it settle into his bones like cold. Whatever the void wanted from him, whatever role it imagined he might play in its schemes, the truth of it lay beneath those dark waters in the drowned city of Naziatar. He would have to go back. Strange rose to his feet, his body protesting the movement. He was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue, the kind of deep tiredness that came from having every cell in his body operating at peak capacity for too long without rest. But rest was a luxury he could not afford. Every hour he spent here was an hour the void had to sink its hooks deeper into his mind, to map his defenses and plan its assault on the reality he had left behind. The cloak stirred around his shoulders, a question without words. Strange touched it briefly, a gesture of reassurance that felt hollow even as he made it. I know, this is a terrible idea, but terrible ideas are something of a specialty of mine. He opened a portal, and this time he aimed it with precision. Not back to the beach where the Shadow Flame entity might still be waiting, but to the city itself, to the streets and structures he had glimpsed through the water during his first encounter. The portal opened onto darkness and pressure, and Strange stepped through before he could allow himself to reconsider. The transition was jarring. One moment he was standing in air, and the next he was submerged in water so cold it drove the breath from his lungs. Strange's hands moved on instinct, weaving the environmental protection spell that Kamertaj taught all students who expected to travel to hostile dimensions. A sphere of breathable air formed around his head, held in place by a lattice of golden energy that filtered out the water while allowing his voice to function normally. He had perhaps 30 minutes before the spell would need to be refreshed. Strange hoped that would be enough. The city stretched out around him, in all directions, vast and alien and somehow beautiful, despite the corruption that clung to every surface. The buildings were not built so much as grown their walls flowing into streets that curved in ways that suggested the architects had considered three-dimensional space a mere suggestion. Towers spiraled up toward the distant surface, their peaks lost in darkness that the sun could not penetrate. And everywhere, there were lights. They hung in the water like captive stars, purple and blue, and occasionally a sickly green that made Strange's eyes water. Some were clearly artificial lamps or lanterns, or their equivalent, but others seemed to be alive creatures that glowed with their own internal luminescence as they drifted through the ruins. Strange descended deeper into the city, following the pull that had become as constant as gravity. The third eye guided him, responding to something in the architecture or the water or the corruption itself, drawing him toward the heart of Naziatar, with the inevitability of a river flowing downhill. He passed structures that must have been homes once, though the beings who had lived in them had possessed neither his physiology nor his understanding of space. Doorways opened onto rooms that seemed larger on the inside than the outside, violating every principle of dimensional stability Strange had learned. Windows looked out onto views that could not possibly exist given the building's position, showing scenes of places that might have been memory or prophecy, or something that existed in the space between the two. And he was not alone. The Naga moved through the water with a grace that was hypnotic and horrible in equal measure. They were serpentine from the waist down, their lower bodies. Powerful coils of muscle and scale that propelled them through the depths with minimal effort. But their upper bodies were humanoid, more or less, though twisted by magic and mutation, into forms that suggested the ocean had claimed them long ago and refused to let go. Some had extra arms, some had faces that were more fish than human, with gills that pulsed rhythmically and eyes that reflected light like mirrors. Strange froze as a patrol of them passed perhaps 20 feet above him, their tridents held loosely, but ready scanning the ruins with the casual alertness of soldiers on familiar ground. He pressed himself against a wall covered in barnacles that whispered in voices too quiet to understand, and held his breath despite the fact that his breathing could not be heard underwater. The Naga did not see him, or if they did, they chose not to investigate. Strange watched them disappear into the gloom, then forced himself to keep moving. Standing still, giving in to fear, would accomplish nothing except to drain his protection spell's reserves faster. He descended another level, then another, following stairways that had been designed for bodies that moved through water rather than air, their steps spaced at intervals that felt wrong to his land-adapted muscles. The architecture grew stranger the deeper he went, less concerned with function and more concerned with form, as if the builders had been trying to express concepts that had no physical equivalent. Strange recognized the aesthetic. He had seen it before in the brief glimpses the Darkhold had given him of places that should not exist. This was old god architecture, the visual language of beings who had existed before the concepts of up and down had been codified, who had built according to principles that predated geometry itself. A sound echoed through the water, low and resonant, more felt than heard. Strange stopped, every sense suddenly alert. The sound came again, and this time he could identify it as language, though no language he had ever encountered. It was too old, too fundamental, each syllable carrying meanings that his mind could not quite grasp, but his body understood at a visceral level. The Naga were chanting. Strange moved towards the sound, more carefully now, using every stealth technique he had learned from Wong and the Ancient One. He stayed in shadows that were not quite shadows, moved through spaces that were technically empty, but felt full, breathed in rhythms that matched the ambient pressure of the water, so that his protection spell would not create telltale disturbances. The chanting grew louder. Strange rounded a corner and found himself looking down into a plaza that must have been 100 feet across its floor, covered in symbols that glowed with the same purple light as the corruption on the mountain. Naga filled the space, dozens of them, their bodies swaying in unison as they chanted in that terrible old language. And at the center of the plaza, bound in chains that seemed to be made of solidified water, was a creature that made Strange's breath catch. It was beautiful and broken, in equal measure, its body covered in scales that shifted between every color Strange had ever seen and several he had not. Wings, vestigial and torn, hung from its back like tattered flags. Its face was almost human, almost familiar. But the eyes that stared out from that face held an intelligence that was absolutely not human, absolutely not sane. The Naga were not chanting to it. They were chanting at it, and Strange could feel the magic of the ritual pressing down on the creature, like a weight forcing it to remain still, forcing it to endure whatever purpose they had bound it for. One of the Naga, larger than the others, and wearing a headdress made from what looked like coral and bone, broke from the chanting and spoke in a language Strange could understand. The words were accented strangely, vowels stretched and consonants clipped, but comprehensible. The one with the devouring eye approaches. We have felt his presence in the waters, tasted his corruption in the currents. The queen will want to know of this, will want. Another Naga, smaller, but carrying itself with the confidence of authority, responded. The eye marks him as herald or harbinger. Either way, he is not to be interfered with. The old ones have claimed him already. We would be wise not to draw their attention by touching what they have marked as their own. Strange's blood went cold. They knew he was here. Perhaps not his exact location, but they knew he was in the city, knew what he carried, and had decided that leaving him alone was safer than confronting him. It should have been reassuring. Instead, it terrified him. What kind of power did the old gods possess that even their servants feared to act against someone merely marked by their influence? The third eye pulsed, and Strange felt a wave of vertigo wash over him. The chanting of the Naga was resonating with the corruption in his forehead, creating a feedback loop that made the world spin and blur. He pressed his hand against the wall to steady himself, and the barnacles whispered louder, now their voices rising from incomprehensible to almost words. Come down, come deeper, see what waits. Strange backed away from the plaza, moving as quickly as he dared while still maintaining stealth. He needed distance, needed to get away from the concentrated ritual magic before it could overwhelm his defenses entirely. The Naga might have decided not to attack him directly, but that did not mean he was safe among them. He found a side passage, narrow and dark, that led away from the plaza. Strange slipped into it, letting the water and the darkness swallow him, and tried to ignore the way the walls seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. The passage descended at a steep angle, more tunnel than hallway, and Strange had to brace himself against the walls to avoid sliding down too quickly. The protection spell around his head flickered once, a warning that its reserves were running low, and Strange stopped long enough to refresh it. The spell matrix was simple enough, woven from basic principles that any first-year Kamar-Taj student could execute. But down here, surrounded by so much corrupted magic, even simple spells required more power than they should have. The tunnel opened onto a chamber that took Strange's breath away. It was vast, easily the size of Grand Central Terminal, its ceiling lost in darkness that his magical light could not penetrate. But it was not the size that stopped him. It was what filled it. Memory rifts. Strange had encountered the phenomenon only once before in a pocket dimension that had collapsed in on itself, leaving behind tears in the fabric of reality, where past events continued to play out like recordings stuck on repeat. But those had been small, unstable, dangerous only if approached too closely. These were different. They hung in the water like windows made of liquid crystal, each one showing scenes from moments that may or may not have actually occurred. Strange saw battles fought in cities that did not match Nazi-Jatar's architecture. Saw beings that might have been gods or might have been something else entirely locked in conflicts that shattered continents with their passing. Saw a woman with black hair and eyes that glowed with purple fire reaching toward him. with hands that promised peace and delivered only dissolution, and he saw Donna. The rift was smaller than the others, no larger than a dinner plate, but it burned with a clarity that the others lacked. Through it, Strange could see the frozen lake from his childhood, could see the girl who had been his sister skating across ice that was already beginning to crack. He could see himself younger and powerless and terrified, reaching out with hands that could not quite bridge the distance. Strange's hand moved toward the rift before he could stop himself, drawn by a need that transcended logic or self-preservation. If he could just touch it, just reach through and change what had happened, save her the way he had failed to save her before. His fingers brushed the surface of the rift, and agony exploded through his entire body. It was not physical pain, though his nerves certainly interpreted it that way. It was the pain of memory made manifest of every moment of guilt and failure condensed into a single instant of absolute clarity. Strange saw himself as he had been arrogant and brilliant and utterly unprepared for the responsibility that would one day be thrust upon him. Saw every patient he had turned away because they were not interesting enough, not challenging enough, not likely to enhance his reputation. Saw Christine Palmer's face as he had chosen his career over their relationship again and again until she had finally stopped asking him to choose. Saw Tony Stark dying with the Infinity Stones burning through his arm, sacrificing himself. Because Strange had seen the future and decided that this was the only way. The third eye opened not metaphorically, but literally, a vertical slit appearing on Strange's forehead and gazing directly into the rift with hunger that was not entirely his own. A voice spoke not from the rift, but from the water itself, from the stones and the corruption and the weight of all the dark places where light had given up trying to reach. These memories are not mine to show you. They are yours, your pain, your failures, your guilt. I merely provide the mirror. What you see reflected there is what you carry always. Strange tore his hand away from the rift, breaking the connection with an effort that left him gasping. The third eye closed slowly, reluctantly, as if disappointed to lose its view. This was not an attack. This was a demonstration. The void was showing him what it could do, how easily it could reach into his mind and pull out the things he had buried deepest. It was showing him that resistance was pointless, that he was already compromised, that accepting what the void offered was the only rational choice. Strange pressed his back against the wall, his heart hammering, and forced himself to think through the fear. The voice had been right about one thing. These were his memories, his failures. The void could amplify them, could force him to confront them, but it had not created them. The guilt was real. The pain was real. Trying to deny that would only make him more vulnerable, but the voice had been wrong about something too. It had assumed that pain was weakness, that guilt was vulnerability. It had made the same mistake that so many beings of power made when confronting humanity. It had assumed that feeling broken meant being broken. Strange had learned differently. Had learned it from the Ancient One in her final moments, had learned it from watching Tony Stark choose sacrifice over survival, had learned it from Peter Parker's determination to save everyone, even when saving everyone was impossible. Pain did not make you weak. Pain made you human. And humanity, with all its flaws and failures and foolish hopes, had a way of surviving things that should have destroyed it. Strange pushed himself away from the wall and looked directly at the largest of the memory rifts, the one that showed the woman with purple fire in her eyes. I know what you are doing. You are trying to break me down, make me desperate enough to accept whatever bargain you offer. But I have bargained with entities that make you look like children playing with matches. I have died and returned. I have watched universes collapse. You will need to try harder. The voice did not respond immediately. When it finally did, there was something in its tone that might have been respect or might have been amusement. Strange could not tell which, and he suspected the distinction might not matter. You think yourself strong. You think your pain has tempered you into something unbreakable. Perhaps you are correct. Perhaps you will resist where others have fallen. It would be entertaining to discover the truth. The memory rifts began to pulse, their edges growing sharper, their images more vivid. Strange could feel the pull intensifying, each rift calling to him with promises of resolution, of closure, of the chance to finally make right what had gone wrong. But beneath the promises was something else. A current in the water, a shift in the pressure, a sense of presence that made every instinct Strange possess scream warnings. Something was coming. Something large and hungry, and very interested in the sorcerer who had been foolish enough to descend into the deepest parts of the drowned city. Strange's hands began weaving defensive spells before his conscious mind had fully registered the threat. Shields materialized in the water, golden geometric patterns that would hopefully hold long enough for him to escape. He opened a portal back toward the surface, back toward anywhere that was not here. The portal opened onto darkness. Not the darkness of deep water, but a darkness that was absolute, fundamental. The kind of darkness that existed before light had been invented. Through it, Strange heard laughter, low and wet, and infinitely patient. Then the rift in front of him, the one showing Donna on the ice, began to crack. Not the ice in the memory, but the rift itself, reality splitting like glass under pressure. Something was pushing through from the other side, using Strange's own memories as a doorway. And the third eye burned with recognition and terrible anticipation. Strange ran. He did not know which direction he was running, did not care as long as it was away from the rifts and whatever was emerging from them. The cloak wrapped around him, adding its own propulsion to his desperate flight, and together they fled through passages that twisted and turned in ways that might have been architecture or might have been intestines. Behind him, the laughter followed, echoing off walls that had forgotten how to remain solid. And the voice spoke one final time before distance and luck carried Strange beyond its immediate reach. You cannot run from what lives inside you, Stephen Strange. We are patient. We have waited eons. We can wait a little longer while you exhaust yourself with futile escape. And when you finally stop, when exhaustion or despair or simple curiosity brings you back to us, we will be here. We will always be here. Because you are marked now. You are ours. And deep down in the place where you hide from yourself, you know this is true. Strange did not respond. He simply swam upward toward the faint light that marked the surface, toward air and space, and anywhere that was not the crushing depths of Naziatar. His protection spell flickered and died, but he was close enough now that it did not matter. His head broke the surface, and he gasped in air that tasted like salt. Salt and corruption in equal measure. The black sand beach stretched before him empty, except for the shadow flame entity's tracks, already being erased by the tide. Strange dragged himself onto the shore and collapsed his body, shaking with exhaustion that went far beyond the physical. The third eye throbbed once, a reminder of the bond that had been forged in that chamber of memory rifts, and Strange pressed his hand against it hard enough to hurt. The voice had been right about one thing. He could not run from what lived inside him. But perhaps if he was clever enough, desperate enough, stubborn enough, he could learn to fight it instead. Strange knew he should move, should find better shelter, should rest, should do any of the 100 things a rational person would do after barely escaping death in the depths of an alien city. But he could not make his body obey. He lay on the black sand, staring up at the false ocean sky, and let exhaustion pin him in place like a specimen under glass. The third eye would not stop burning. It was different from before. Not the sharp pain of active use, but a steady ache that suggested something fundamental had shifted during his encounter with the memory rifts. The void had touched him more deeply than Strange had realized, had mapped his consciousness with a thoroughness that made Algalon's earlier scans seem gentle by comparison. He could feel its presence now, even when it was not actively speaking, a weight at the back of his thoughts that made concentration difficult and silence impossible. The worst part was that the presence felt familiar. Strange closed his eyes and immediately regretted it. Behind his eyelids, images swam in patterns that belonged to no human dream. The frozen lake, the drowned city, the woman with purple fire in her eyes, Tony Stark's face as the infinity stones burned through him, Christine Palmer walking away down a corridor that stretched into infinity, and beneath it all, a voice that was not quite a voice, speaking words that were not quite words, promising things that Strange knew he should reject, but found himself wanting anyway. Peace, understanding, the end of guilt. He opened his eyes and forced himself to sit up. The movement sent new pain lancing through muscles that had been pushed far beyond their limits. Strange ignored it. Pain was familiar. Pain was something he could work with. It was the promises that terrified him. The beach was empty except for the waves and the fading tracks of the shadow flame entity. Strange stared at those tracks, watching them disappear as the tide erased them grain by grain, and wondered if that was what the void intended for him. Not destruction, but dissolution. A slow erasure of everything that made him Stephen Strange until only the corruption remained, wearing his face and carrying his memories, but serving purposes that had nothing to do with protecting Earth or honoring the oaths he had sworn. He would not allow it. Could not allow it. Strange had sacrificed too much, had endured too much, had watched too many people die because he had made the hard choices. If he fell now, if he let the void claim him, then all of those sacrifices would mean nothing. Tony would have died for nothing. The Ancient One would have trained him for nothing. Peter Parker would forget him for nothing. Strange stood swaying slightly and looked out across the water toward the distant lights of Naziatar. The voice had been right about one thing. He could not run from what lived inside him. The corruption was not external, not something he could simply cut away or wall off with sufficient protective spells. It was woven into the fabric of his being, now as much a part of him as his damaged hands or his photographic memory. Fighting it directly would only exhaust him, leave him vulnerable to the next attack. But perhaps he did not need to fight it. Perhaps he needed to understand it. Strange's hands moved through the diagnostic patterns almost without conscious thought, muscle memory taking over where deliberate action would have failed. Golden light traced geometries in the air, each one designed to map and measure the flow of mystical energy through his own body. He had performed this spell countless times since the Darkhold had left its mark, searching for some weakness in the corruption structure, some point where it could be safely disrupted. He had never found one. The corruption was too thorough, too deeply integrated. It had replaced parts of his consciousness so completely that removing it would be like removing pieces of his brain. He would survive, but what remained would not be him. The diagnostic spell completed, and Strange studied the results with a detachment that years of medical training had taught him. The corruption was spreading. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but spreading nonetheless. Every time he used magic, every time he tapped into the power that made him one of Earth's greatest defenders, he fed it. Gave it more of himself to consume and reshape. At his current rate of magical use, he had perhaps 3 months before the corruption reached critical mass. 6 months. If he rationed his power carefully, avoided major spell casting, let himself become weak and vulnerable in the name of preserving what remained of his humanity. Strange dismissed the diagnostic display and laughed a short, bitter sound that the wind carried away across the water. 3 to 6 months. As if time mattered anymore. as if he had any hope of surviving that long in a world where cosmic entities wanted him erased and ancient gods wanted him enslaved. The third eye pulsed, and the world changed. There was no transition, no sense of movement or displacement. One moment, Strange was standing on the beach, and the next, he was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that should not exist, but did anyway, because the void cared nothing for the limitations of physics or the complaints of rational minds. He stood on ice. The frozen lake stretched out around him in all directions, its surface smooth and perfect except for the cracks. They were thin lines at first barely visible against the crystalline surface, but they spread as Strange watched, growing wider and deeper, with a patience that suggested the ice had been waiting a long time for this moment. Strange's breath misted in the air. He was no longer wearing his robes and the cloak. Instead, he wore the clothes of his childhood jeans and a jacket that was not warm enough for winter in Nebraska. And his hands were whole and steady and unblemished by the accident that had defined his adult life. He knew this place. Had known it the moment his feet touched the ice, had felt the recognition settle into his bones with the weight of inevitability. This was not a memory rift like the ones in Naziatar. This was the memory itself, the original trauma pulled from his mind and given form by power that did not distinguish between past and present. Laughter echoed across the frozen lake, high and bright and achingly familiar. Strange turned and saw her. Donna skated toward him with the careless grace of a child who had not yet learned to fear falling. She was exactly as he remembered, her dark hair flying behind her smile wide, and unguarded eyes shining with the simple joy of movement and winter air and a day spent with her brother. She was 8 years old and perfect and alive, and Strange felt something break inside him at the sight of her. This was not real. He knew that. Understood it with the part of his mind that was still Dr. Stephen Strange, sorcerer, supreme master of the mystic arts. But knowing did not matter. Seeing her, hearing her laughter, feeling the cold air that they had shared on the day she died, all of it bypassed reason and struck directly at the wound that had never healed. "Stephen, catch me." She spun in a circle, showing off, and Strange felt his body move forward without conscious decision. His feet found purchase on the ice with an ease that the adult him had lost decades ago. He skated toward her, reaching out with hands that could still feel texture and temperature without the constant ache of nerve damage. "Wait, Donna, the ice is too thin." She laughed and spun away from him, moving toward the center of the lake where the ice was darkest. Strange followed, knowing what would happen, unable to stop himself from playing out the scene exactly as it had occurred 25 years ago. The crack was not loud. That was the detail that had haunted Strange for decades afterward. In movies and television shows, ice breaking was always accompanied by dramatic sound effects, great booming crashes that gave people time to react. But real ice cracking was quiet, almost polite a sound, like a zipper being undone or glass being gently scored. Donna looked down, and her expression shifted from joy to confusion to fear in the space between heartbeats. The ice gave way. Strange lunged forward, his hand, outstretched fingers grasping for hers. He was close, so close, his fingertips brushing against her jacket as she fell. But not close enough. Never close enough. She slipped beneath the surface, her eyes wide and mouth open in a scream that the water swallowed before it could fully form. And then there was nothing but the hole in the ice and the dark water beneath. Strange threw himself at the hole, trying to reach through, trying to pull her back up. But his hands could not find her, could not even see her in the murky darkness. He screamed. Her name screamed until his throat was raw, and his lungs burned, and the ice around the hole began to crack further, threatening to drag him down as well. He did not care. Would have welcomed it? Welcomed drowning if it meant not having to live with the memory of her disappearing into water that was cold enough to kill in minutes. But strong hands grabbed him from behind, pulled him back from the hole, dragged him toward the shore while he fought and screamed and begged to be let go. The memory should have ended there. should have released him back to the beach in Nadsyatar, having made its point about pain and failure and the impossibility of escape. But it did not end. Instead, the scene froze, locked in place with Strange on his knees and the hole in the ice still open, and a voice spoke from everywhere and nowhere at once. This is where you broke Stephen Strange. This is where the child you were died and the man you became was born. Everything you have accomplished, every life you have saved, every sacrifice you have made, all of it stems from this moment. From your failure to save one small girl from cold water and colder fate. Strange said nothing. His throat was closed, his chest tight with grief that felt as fresh as if Donna had died yesterday, rather than decades ago. The voice continued, gentle now, almost soothing. I can change it. Can reach back through time and twist reality until this moment unfolds differently. Until your hand catches hers. Until she lives and you are not defined by loss. The power required is considerable, but I possess it. The void contains all possibilities, all potential outcomes. I need only select the one where she survives and make it real. Strange found his voice, though it came out broken and hoarse. Nothing comes without cost. What would you demand in return? Only what you have already given. The door between our worlds. The path from your reality to mine. You have walked it once already. Walking it again, this time willingly, would be trivial. And in exchange, I give you what you want most. Your sister. Alive, whole, unburdened by the death that has haunted you for 25 years. The offer hung in the air between them, perfect in its simplicity and terrible in its implications. Strange stared at the hole in the ice and felt the weight of every year since Donna's death pressing down on him. 25 years of guilt. 25 years of trying to save enough people that the scales might somehow balance. 25 years of waking from nightmares where he reached for her hand and missed. He could end it. Could accept the bargain and finally be free of the weight he had carried since childhood. All he had to do was open a door that he knew how to open, show the void the way to Earth, and let beings older than human civilization have access to a reality that had no defenses against the kind of corruption they represented. 7 billion lives against one. The calculus was simple, obvious. No rational being could justify the trade. But rationality had nothing to do with the way Strange's hand trembled as he looked at the hole in the ice. Nothing to do with the way his heart hammered against his ribs or the way his breath came short and fast. Reason had no power here. Only grief. Only the desperate, impossible hope that he could undo what had been done and save the one person he had never been able to save. Strange closed his eyes and thought of Tony Stark. Thought of the man who had chosen to sacrifice himself rather than let Thanos win. Who had snapped his fingers knowing it would kill him. Knowing he would never see his daughter grow up. Knowing that his wife would grieve. And his friends would mourn. And the world would lose one of its greatest defenders. But he had done it anyway. Because that was what heroes did. They made the hard choice. They sacrificed what they loved most to protect what mattered more. Strange had watched it happen. Had seen the future and known it was the only way. Had condemned Tony to death with full knowledge of what he was doing. And Tony, brilliant and impossible and fundamentally good despite all his flaws, had trusted that Strange's choice was the right one. How could Strange do any less now? He opened his eyes and looked at the frozen image of his sister disappearing beneath the ice. Looked at the grief that had defined him. The wound that had never healed the motivation behind every life he had saved and every oath he had sworn. And he spoke words that felt like tearing pieces from his soul. No, the voice was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, there was something in its tone that might have been surprise or might have been respect. You refuse. even knowing that this is your only chance. Even understanding that I will not offer again. Strange stood his legs, trembling, but steady enough to support his weight. If I could save her by damning others, I would not be the person she would want me to be. If I could undo my failure by creating a greater one, I would dishonor every sacrifice that failure motivated. The pain does not make me weak. It makes me human. And humanity, for all its flaws, understands something that you do not. And what is that marked one? That memory and grief are not chains to be broken. They are foundations to be built upon. I failed to save Donna. I have failed to save countless others since. But those failures taught me that some things are worth dying for, worth suffering for, worth carrying the weight of forever, if that is what protecting them requires. Strange pressed his hand against his forehead, against the third eye that burned with the void's regard. You want to use my pain as a doorway. But pain is not weakness. It is proof that I loved something enough to be hurt by its loss. And I would rather carry that hurt for eternity than betray what it represents by opening your door. The frozen image shattered, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once. The ice Donna, the memory itself, all of it broke apart like a reflection in disturbed water. Strange felt the dissolution, felt himself being pulled back toward his own body and his own time. And in the instant before the vision released him completely, he heard the voice speak one final time. You are stronger than I anticipated, Stephen Strange. More foolish, certainly, but stronger. You have won this battle. But the war is far from over. Your corruption spreads, your time diminishes, and when you finally break, when exhaustion or despair or simple entropy wears away, what remains of your resistance, I will be waiting. I will always be waiting. Then Strange was back on the beach, his body convulsing as the transition tore through him. He collapsed onto the black sand, gasping, his hands pressed against his face as tears. He had not allowed himself to shed in decades, finally forced their way free. He had won. Had refused the void's offer. Had chosen the greater good over his own pain. But the victory felt hollow. Because the void had been right about one thing. The corruption was spreading. His time was running out. And he had just used up his one chance at peace to protect a world that he might never see again. Strange lay on the sand and wept, and the third eye watched without judgment. Patient and eternal, and utterly indifferent to the grief of the human who carried it. Strange did not know how long he lay on the beach after the memory rift released him. Time had become slippery again, hours bleeding into minutes, or perhaps the reverse. His body ached in ways that transcended physical damage, as if the void's assault had left bruises on his soul that would take far longer to heal than broken bones or torn muscles. But he could not afford to rest. Not here, not now. The void had tested him and found him resistant, but resistance was not victory. It was merely postponement. The corruption in his forehead continued to spread, and every moment he spent in this world brought him closer to the point where resistance would become impossible. Strange forced himself to sit up. The black sand clung to his robes, leaving streaks of dark crystal that glowed faintly with purple light. He brushed at them absently, knowing the gesture was futile, but needing the normalcy of the action anyway. The ocean before him had changed. Or perhaps it had always been this way. And Strange was only now able to perceive it correctly. The water no longer simply reflected the false sky above. Instead, it seemed to contain its own internal luminescence, a glow that pulsed in rhythm with something deep below the surface. Not a heartbeat, not exactly, but close enough to be disturbing. Strange extended his senses, reaching out with the diagnostic magic that had become as natural to him as breathing. What he felt made his blood run cold. The concentration of void energy beneath the ocean had intensified dramatically. where before it had been diffuse, spread throughout Nazjatar like poison in water now. It was coalescing, gathering in a single location with the purposeful movement of something that had decided the time for subtlety had passed. And he was not the only one who had noticed. The sky above Ulduar flared with light, cold and blue-white and utterly inhuman. Strange recognized the signature immediately. Algalon was mobilizing. The Titan construct had detected the same concentration of void energy and was responding with the mechanical efficiency of a being designed for one purpose: containment, purification, reorigination if necessary. Strange climbed to his feet, swaying slightly as exhaustion tried to pull him back down. He needed to see what was happening, needed to understand what the void was doing and why it had chosen now, immediately after his rejection of its offer, to act so openly. He opened a portal, aiming for a vantage point above the ocean, where he could observe without being immediately detected. The portal snapped into existence with less resistance than he expected, as if reality itself had grown tired of trying to keep him out of places he should not go. Strange stepped through and found himself hovering 100 feet above the water, held aloft by the cloak and his own increasingly depleted reserves of magical energy. From here he could see the entirety of Nazjatar spread out below him like a map drawn in shadows and purple fire. The city was no longer dormant. Lights blazed in windows that had been dark. The Naga moved through the streets in patterns that suggested preparations for either defense or exodus. And at the very center of the city, in a plaza that Strange had not noticed during his earlier descent, something was rising from the depths. The Void Heart. Strange had no other name for it. It was not a physical object in any conventional sense, but rather a concentration of darkness, so absolute that it seemed to consume light, rather than simply block it. It pulsed with the same rhythm as the ocean around it. And Strange realized with growing horror that the pulse was not coming from the heart itself. The heart was merely making visible what had always been there. The heartbeat of the void. The fundamental rhythm of corruption and hunger and patient, eternal malice. Movement to his left caught Strange's attention. He turned and saw the shadow flame entity emerge from the water perhaps a quarter mile away. It was larger than before, or perhaps it had simply stopped pretending to be constrained by conventional size. Its wings spread wide enough to block out significant portions of the sky, and the black fire that clung to its body burned with an intensity that made Strange's eyes water, even at this distance. The entity was not approaching him. It was approaching the heart, drawn to the concentration of void energy, the way a moth was drawn to flame. Strange watched it descend toward the plaza, its movements almost reverent, and understood that this was not simply a creature. It was a pilgrim. The shadow flame entity had been waiting for this moment for the heart to manifest. And now that it had the entity intended to claim whatever power the heart offered. A sound like thunder split the air, but it came from above rather than below. Strange looked up and saw them descending from Ulduar, the Titan constructs. They were massive, easily 20 feet tall, their bodies composed of some material that seemed to be equal parts stone and starlight. They moved with perfect synchronization, a dozen of them arranged in a formation that suggested military precision. Each one carried weapons that Strange could not identify, but recognized as dangerous from the way reality itself seemed to flinch away from them. Algalon led them, his form blazing with cold light that painted the false sky in shades of blue and silver. He did not acknowledge Strange's presence. His attention was fixed entirely on the void heart and the shadow flame entity that approached it. Strange found himself trapped between three forces, each one powerful enough to reshape continents, and none of them particularly concerned with his survival. The void heart pulsed below. The shadow flame entity descended toward it. The Titan constructs prepared to contain or destroy both. And Strange hung in the air between them, exhausted and corrupted, and increasingly certain that he had made a terrible mistake in refusing the void's offer. Not because he regretted the choice. He would make the same choice again, would accept the same consequences. But because he had assumed that refusing the void would give him time, would allow him to find his own way home to solve this problem with the tools and knowledge he had spent years accumulating. He had been wrong. The void had not offered him peace out of kindness or even desire. It had offered him peace because it knew what was coming, knew that the heart would manifest and draw every significant power on AzeRoth to this single location, knew that Strange would be caught in the middle of a conflict that made the Battle of Earth look like a schoolyard fight. The void had offered him an escape from this moment, and in refusing, Strange had condemned himself to survive it instead. The shadow flame entity reached the plaza first. It landed with an impact that sent shockwaves rippling across the water and immediately began to circle the heart. The black flames that composed its body intensified, reaching out toward the heart, like seeking fingers trying to establish connection or control or perhaps simple communion. The Titan constructs opened fire. Strange had seen advanced weapons before, had fought alongside Iron Man and observed Wakandan technology and studied artifacts from civilizations that predated humanity. But the weapons the constructs wielded operated on principles that made Earth's most sophisticated tools look like sharpened sticks. They did not simply damage matter. They edited it. Each blast that struck the shadow flame entity did not burn or explode or tear. It simply convinced the affected portions of the entity that they had never existed in the first place. The entity screamed a sound that was equal parts rage and pain and something else that Strange could not quite identify. It lashed out with its own power, black fire meeting cold starlight in collisions that sent Strange tumbling backward through the air despite his distance from the combat. The cloak wrapped around him, stabilizing his flight, and Strange used the momentary reprieve to analyze the situation with the same clinical detachment he had once applied to complex surgeries. The shadow flame entity wanted the heart's power. The Titan constructs wanted to contain or destroy both. And beneath it all, the void itself watched and waited, using this conflict to accomplish goals that Strange could not yet perceive. There had to be a pattern, a strategy. The void was ancient and patient, and had survived countless attempts to destroy it. It would not manifest the heart now in this way, without having accounted for every possible response. Strange's eyes widened as understanding struck him with the force of physical impact. This was not an accident. This was orchestration. The void had drawn all three parties here, deliberately. The shadow flame entity seeking power. The Titan constructs seeking containment. And Strange himself, corrupted and desperate, and carrying within him a direct connection to the void's influence. The battle below was not the goal. It was the distraction. Strange looked at this heart again this time, not as a concentration of void energy, but as a mechanism. He traced the flows of power moving through it, mapped the connections between it and the surrounding environment, and saw what he should have seen immediately. The heart was not simply manifesting void energy. It was anchoring it, creating a stable channel between this reality and whatever realm the void truly called home. And every moment the battle continued, every expenditure of power by the constructs and the entity fed more energy into that channel, strengthened it, made it more difficult to collapse. Strange had perhaps minutes before the channel became permanent, before the void finished using him and everyone else as pawns in a game that had been playing out since before humanity learned to make fire. He needed to close the channel, needed to sever the heart's connection to its source. But doing so would require power he no longer possessed, would require him to dive directly into the center of a three-way battle between beings that could kill him with casual effort. The third eye pulsed, and Strange felt the void's attention focus on him with sudden intensity. The voice spoke no longer coming from beneath the water, but from inside his own head, intimate and terrible. You understand now. You see what I have built, and why your refusal meant nothing. The door you would not open willingly I have opened through other means. Your resistance was admirable, but ultimately irrelevant. The channel is established. My influence spreads. And there is nothing you can do to stop it. Strange pressed his hand against his forehead, against the third eye that burned with the void's regard, and smiled. It was not a pleasant smile, not the expression of someone who had found hope or discovered a clever solution. It was the smile of a man who had been backed into a corner so completely that the only option left was to do something monumentally stupid. You are right about one thing. I cannot close the channel with my own power, but I do not need to close it. I only need to redirect it. The void's attention sharpened curiosity, mixing with suspicion. Strange began weaving a spell. Not one from Kamartaj's teachings, not one from any grimoire or sanctioned text. This was something he had been developing in the back of his mind since the moment Algalon had tried to isolate him from reality. A hybrid construction that drew equally from mystical tradition and quantum mechanics, from the Ancient One's philosophy and his own desperate innovation. If he could not close the channel, he could point it somewhere else. Could redirect the flow of void energy away from AzeRoth and back toward its source. Turn the invasion into implosion. Use the void's own power against itself. It would require him to serve as the conduit. Would require him to channel energies that were already corrupting him, that would almost certainly destroy what remained of his humanity, even if the process did not kill him outright. Strange thought of Tony Stark one final time. Thought of the man who had looked at an impossible situation and decided that his life was an acceptable cost for victory. Thought of the trust Tony had placed in him, in his judgment, in his willingness to make the hard choice, when the hard choice was the only choice that mattered. Then Strange dismissed the portal that held him aloft and let himself fall toward the heart, toward the battle, toward the channel that would either save two worlds or destroy them both. The void realized his intention too late to stop him, and its voice filled his mind with rage and something that might have been respect. You foolish, brilliant, suicidal creature. You would sacrifice yourself to close a door you cannot even see. Strange's response was simple and final. I would sacrifice anything to protect what matters. That is what heroes do. Then he plunged into the heart, and the world became nothing but light and darkness, and the terrible sound of reality screaming as it was forced to bend in ways it was never meant to bend. The heart did not consume Strange so much as it unmade him. For an instant that stretched into eternity, he existed in all states simultaneously, alive and dead, present and absent, human and something else entirely. The void energy tore through him with the patient thoroughness of a surgeon dissecting a specimen, stripping away every defense he had constructed over years of training and discipline. But Strange had expected pain, had prepared for dissolution. What he had not anticipated was the clarity. Inside the heart, surrounded by corruption that should have destroyed his mind within seconds, Strange could see. Not with his eyes, or even with the third eye that burned on his forehead, but with something deeper. He perceived the channel the void had constructed, saw it as a living thing, a tendril of impossible geometry that stretched between AzeRoth and a realm that had no name in any human language, and he understood how to break it. The spell he had been constructing crystallized in his mind with perfect precision. It was elegant in its simplicity, brutal in its requirements. He would not close the channel. He would reverse it. Turn the flow of energy back on itself, force the void to consume its own invasion, use the very power it had marshaled for conquest as the instrument of its defeat. But the spell required an anchor, a fixed point capable of withstanding energies that would tear apart anything less than a cosmic constant. Strange had nothing like that available. Nothing except himself. He began the casting before the void could interfere, before his own survival instinct could override his determination. Golden light erupted from his hands, not the normal manifestation of Kamartaj's teachings, but something older, something that drew from the fundamental structure of his being, rather than accumulated knowledge. The channel noticed and responded with the full weight of its attention. Pain exploded through Strange's nervous system, so absolute that it transcended physical sensation entirely. His body convulsed blood vessels, rupturing bones creaking under pressure that existed in more dimensions than 3. The third eye opened fully, no longer simply a scar, but a genuine aperture gazing directly into the heart of the void, with recognition that was mutual and terrible. But Strange did not stop casting. Outside the heart, the battle had intensified. The Titan constructs formed a perimeter around the plaza, their weapons firing in perfectly coordinated patterns. Each blast was calculated to cause maximum disruption to the void energy, while minimizing damage to AzeRoth's dimensional substrate. They were not trying to destroy the heart. They were trying to contain it, to buy time for Algalon to analyze the phenomenon and determine the optimal response. The Shadow Flame entity had no such patience. It attacked the constructs with the fury of something that had waited eons for this opportunity and would not be denied. Black fire met cold starlight in collisions that sent shockwaves rippling across the ocean. Where the entity's flame struck, reality itself began to burn, leaving gaps in the fabric of space that took precious seconds to repair. Algalon observed from above, his form blazing with light that painted everything in stark relief. He had recognized Strange's presence within the heart, had calculated the probability of the human survival at less than 0.03%, and had dismissed it as irrelevant to the larger threat. The heart was what mattered. The channel was what mattered. One human life, even one as anomalous as Stephen Strange, could not be allowed to interfere with proper containment protocols. But then something changed. The heart's pulse stuttered. Just for an instant, just long enough for Algalon's sensors to register the irregularity. The perfect rhythm faltered, and from within the darkness came a flare of golden light that had no business existing in a place where the void held absolute dominion. Algalon recalculated. Strange was not dying. He was fighting. And somehow, impossibly, he was winning. Inside the heart, Strange's spell reached its critical phase. The channel resisted, of course. It was designed to resist, built from principles that predated physics and would outlast entropy. But Strange was not attacking the channel's structure. He was attacking its purpose. Every conduit required a direction, a flow from source to destination. Strange's spell did not block that flow. It simply convinced the channel that its source and destination were the same location. The void energy began to reverse. It was not immediate. The amount of power the void had committed to this invasion was staggering, too much to simply redirect in an instant. But the flow was slowing, hesitating, and Strange poured everything he had into maintaining the reversal. Every reserve of magical energy, every technique he had learned, every desperate innovation his brilliant mind could conceive. The void fought back. Memory struck him like a physical blow. Donna drowning, the Ancient One dying, Tony Stark burning, Christine Palmer walking away, Peter Parker forgetting. Every failure, every loss, every moment of weakness and doubt and fear, all of it weaponized and thrust directly into his consciousness. Strange screamed the sound, lost in the roar of energies that were never meant to coexist, and held the spell together through sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. The third eye blazed. For a terrible moment, Strange felt the void trying to claim it completely, trying to use the corruption within him as a foothold to tear the spell apart from the inside. His forehead split, blood running down his face in streams that glowed purple in the darkness, and the eye began to expand, growing larger, trying to consume his entire skull. Strange thought of Tony Stark, thought of the man who had looked at the assembled might of Thanos' army and decided that his life was an acceptable price for victory. Who had worn the Infinity Stones, knowing they would kill him, knowing his daughter would grow up without a father, knowing his wife would grieve and his friends would mourn? And he had snapped his fingers anyway, because that was what heroism meant. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Strange pressed his hand against the expanding eye, feeling flesh tear and bone crack, and spoke words that were part spell and part prayer and part defiance. I am not my corruption. I am not my failures. I am what I choose to be. And I choose to be the man who closes this door. The spell completed, reality convulsed. The channel stretched between two worlds, and carrying energies meant to corrupt an entire planet suddenly found its flow reversed. The void energy that had been pouring into AzeRoth now rushed backward, dragged by Strange's spell toward its source, with the inexorable force of water circling a drain, and Strange serving as the anchor point for the reversal, felt every molecule of that energy pass through him on its way back to the darkness. His body should have disintegrated, should have been torn apart by forces that were never meant to touch mortal flesh. But the corruption that had been slowly consuming him, the mark the Darkhold had left on his soul, suddenly became his salvation. He was already partly void-touched, already partway to becoming what the channel carried. And that partial transformation was just enough to let him survive the transit. Barely. Outside, Algalon registered the channel's collapse with something approaching surprise. His calculations had not accounted for this possibility. A human using the Void's own power as a weapon against itself was so far outside his operational parameters that he momentarily froze, unable to determine proper response protocol. The Shadow Flame entity screamed. Not in rage this time, but in agony. It had been drawing power from the heart, drinking deep of the Void's essence, and now that flow was not merely stopped, but reversed. The entity was being drained, its carefully accumulated corruption ripped away and sucked back through the channel Strange had inverted. It tried to flee, tried to break contact with the heart and escape before the reversal could consume it entirely. But Strange's spell did not distinguish between willing and unwilling participants. The entity had touched the Void, had claimed kinship with its power, and now it would pay the price for that claim. The black flames that composed the entity's body began to flicker and die. Piece by piece, it was unmade, its essence pulled back through the channel toward the realm it had emerged from. Within seconds, nothing remained but a final echoing scream that faded into silence. The Titan constructs held their position weapons trained on the heart, but no longer firing. Algalon had transmitted new instructions. Observe. Record. Do not interfere. Whatever was happening inside the heart was beyond their ability to influence, and attempting to do so might destabilize the reversal. The heart began to collapse. Not violently, not with the explosive force one might expect from something containing enough energy to corrupt a world. Instead, it folded in on itself with geometric precision, dimensions compressing into singularities, impossible angles smoothing into conventional space. The darkness that had seemed absolute began to thin, and through the thinning darkness, Algalon could see a figure. Strange hung suspended in the air where the heart had been his body, wreathed in residual void energy that sparked and dissipated like dying embers. Blood covered his face and robes. His hands trembled with exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. And on his forehead, the third eye had finally closed, leaving behind a scar that would never fully heal. But he was alive. Algalon descended his perfect features arranged in an expression that might have been curiosity, or might have been calculation. He stopped perhaps 10 feet from Strange, close enough to speak, but far enough to react. If the human proved unstable, you reversed the channel, forced the Void's invasion to consume itself. The probability of success was negligible. The probability of survival less than negligible. Yet you succeeded. Strange tried to speak, but his throat was too raw. He simply nodded the gestures, sending new pain shooting through his skull. Algalon tilted his head, that calculated gesture of inquiry that Strange had seen before. You were correct. My earlier assessment was incomplete. You are not simply a contaminant. You are an adaptive element, a variable that operates outside expected parameters and produces outcomes that should not occur. This is valuable data. Strange found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Glad I could contribute to your research. Algalon ignored the sarcasm, if he even recognized it as such. The channel is closed. The immediate threat is contained. However, the Void's attention has been drawn to this location. More attacks will come. The old gods may be imprisoned, but their influence is not so easily dismissed. Your presence here remains a complication, but perhaps a useful one. Before Strange could respond, before he could even process what Algalon meant by useful movement in the water below, caught his attention. The Naga were emerging from Nazyatar, dozens of them, their tridents lowered in what might have been surrender or might have been respect. And at their head swam a figure that radiated power even from a distance. Not the diffuse corruption of the Void, but something older. Something that had learned to coexist with darkness without being consumed by it. The figure broke the surface and rose into the air, supported by magic that made the water itself seem solid. It was female, or at least presented as such, with features that were beautiful in the way that predators were beautiful. Her eyes held intelligence that was vast and cold and patient. She looked at Strange, then at Algalon, then back at Strange. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that reminded him uncomfortably of the Void's whispers, but there was structure to it, control that the raw corruption lacked. You are the one who closed the channel, who dared to touch the Void's power and turn it against itself. I am Ashara, and you have earned my attention. Strange met her gaze, too exhausted to muster fear or appropriate caution. Wonderful. Another cosmic entity interested in me. Just what I needed. Azashara smiled, and the expression held genuine amusement rather than threat. Rest while you can, Strange One. You have won a battle today, but the war has only begun. The Void does not forget. It does not forgive. And it very much wants you back. Then she sank beneath the waves, taking her Naga with her, leaving Strange alone with Algalon, and the cold realization that closing the channel had not ended his problems. It had only announced to everyone watching that he was more dangerous than they had realized. And in a world where dangerous things attracted very specific kinds of attention, that was perhaps the worst outcome possible. Strange woke to sunlight. Real sunlight, not the false ocean sky or the cold starlight of Ulduar, but genuine warmth on his face. For a moment, he simply lay there, eyes closed, letting the sensation wash over him. It felt like something he had not experienced in years rather than days, and he allowed himself the luxury of pretending that when he opened his eyes, he would be back in the sanctum. That everything since the breach had been nothing more than a particularly vivid nightmare. Then he tried to move, and pain dispelled the illusion immediately. His body felt like it had been taken apart and reassembled by someone who had only a vague understanding of human anatomy. Every muscle ached. His hands trembled with exhaustion that went beyond mere physical fatigue. And his forehead, where the third eye had tried to consume him, burned with a steady heat that suggested the wound would take far longer to heal than ordinary flesh. Strange opened his eyes and found himself looking up at a ceiling made of stone that glowed with soft amber light. Not AzeRothian architecture, or at least not the kind he had seen in Nazjatar or Ulduar. This was simpler, more functional, the work of beings who valued practicality over cosmic significance. A figure moved into his field of vision, and Strange tensed before his exhausted brain recognized the presence as non-threatening. The man was old, or at least appeared old, with a beard that was more white than gray, and eyes that held the particular weariness that came from witnessing too much history. He wore robes that seemed to be woven from twilight itself, and he carried a staff topped with a crystal that pulsed with gentle blue light. The man smiled. The expression was surprisingly warm. "You are awake? Good. For a time, I was uncertain whether you would wake at all. The energies you channeled should have killed you 3 times over. That you survived with only moderate trauma is either a testament to your resilience or evidence of exceptionally poor judgment. Possibly both." Strange's voice came out as a rasp. "Where am I?" "A sanctuary. One of the few places on AzeRoth where the Void's influence cannot easily reach and the Titans do not constantly observe. You have been unconscious for 2 days, while your body attempted to repair damage that, frankly, should not be repairable." The man set his staff aside and sat in a chair that Strange had not noticed before. Up close, the weariness in his eyes was even more pronounced, but there was kindness there too, and curiosity. "I am Khadgar, once the apprentice of Medivh, now simply a wanderer who tries to help where help is needed. I felt your spell from halfway across the world, felt the channel reverse and the Void's invasion collapse in on itself. It was remarkable work, suicidal, but remarkable." Strange tried to sit up. His body protested vehemently, but he managed to prop himself against the wall behind what he now recognized as a bed. The motion sent fresh pain shooting through his skull, and he pressed his hand against his forehead instinctively. The third eye was still there, still closed, thankfully, but present, a permanent reminder of corruption that would never fully leave him. Khadgar watched him with the patient attention of someone who had seen too many injured people push themselves too hard too fast. The scar will remain. The Void's mark cannot be so easily removed, even by one as skilled as yourself. But the channel is closed. The immediate threat is contained. You accomplished what you set out to do, though I suspect the cost was higher than you anticipated. Strange let his hand fall back to his side. The cost is always higher than anticipated. That seems to be a universal constant. Khadgar nodded slowly, and something in his expression suggested he understood far more than Strange had said. You had a choice. When you stood before the heart, when you recognized what it represented, you could have walked away. Could have left AzeRoth to its own defenses and searched for a way home. No one would have blamed you. This is not your world. These are not your people. You owed us nothing. Strange met the older man's gaze. I owed myself. Owed the memory of everyone who trusted me to make the right choice, even when the right choice meant sacrifice. Silence stretched between them, comfortable and companionable. Outside, Strange could hear the distant sound of waves against shore. But they were normal waves this time, untainted by void corruption or ancient malice. Khadgar finally spoke again, his tone shifting to something more philosophical. The void offered you peace, offered to return what you had lost in exchange for opening a door you knew should remain closed. You refused. Why? Strange closed his eyes, and behind his eyelids, he saw Donna falling through the ice. Saw the hole in the frozen lake and the darkness beneath. Felt the familiar weight of grief settle over him like an old coat. Because if I had forgotten the pain, I would have forgotten why the pain mattered. Would have forgotten the girl she was, the brother I was, the reason I became a doctor in the first place. Memory is not meant to be comfortable. It is meant to be true. And the truth, no matter how much it hurts, is what defines us. He opened his eyes and found Khadgar watching him with an expression that might have been approval or might have been something deeper. You understand something that many spend lifetimes failing to learn. Power without wisdom is destruction waiting to happen. But wisdom without acceptance of one's own flaws is simply arrogance in disguise. You have touched darkness, carry its mark, and yet choose to remain yourself. That is no small thing. Strange tried to smile, though the expression felt hollow. Remaining myself seems to be getting more difficult. The corruption is spreading. Slowly, but inevitably. I won this battle, but the war Ashara mentioned is far from over. Khadgar nodded, his expression turning serious. Yes, the void does not forget. You have marked yourself as both threat and opportunity in its perception. It will try again. Perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not for years, but it will try. The question is what you intend to do about that inevitability. Strange looked down at his hands, at the scars that had defined so much of his adult life, at the tremor that had never fully gone away even after magic had restored some of what the accident had taken. I intend to leave. My presence here is a wound in reality, and wounds attract predators. The longer I remain on AzeRoth, the more danger I pose to this world. The channel is closed, but the connection between your reality and mine has been established. The void knows Earth exists now, knows that there are other worlds to corrupt. If I stay, I become a beacon drawing that attention here. And what of your own world? The void will not simply forget Earth because you have left AzeRoth. No. But Earth has defenders. Has the Sanctums and Kamartaj and Wong, who is far better at the political aspects of Sorcerer Supreme than I ever was. And if the void does come, if it tries to use the connection I inadvertently created, at least I will be there to help fight it on familiar ground. Khadgar stood, retrieving his staff. Then, I will help you open a portal home. The dimensional barriers between our realities are still weak from the breach. It should be possible to establish a stable pathway, though I would recommend waiting until you have recovered more fully. Dimensional travel in your current state would be unwise. Strange pushed himself fully upright, ignoring the way his body screamed protest. Unwise seems to be my specialty, and every hour I delay is an hour the void has to plan its next move. I have stayed too long already. Khadgar studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. I will prepare the necessary components. But first, answer me one question. Do you regret refusing the void's offer? In the quiet moments when the pain becomes too much, do you wish you had chosen differently? Strange thought of Donna, thought of the frozen lake and the hole in the ice, and 25 years of grief that had shaped every choice he had made since. Thought of the peace he could have had if he had simply said yes, had opened the door and damned Earth in exchange for the one thing he wanted most. And he thought of Tony Stark, dying with the Infinity Stones burning through him, sacrificing everything so that others might live. No, I do not regret it. The pain reminds me why I fight, reminds me what I am protecting and who I was before I learned what protection truly costs. If I had traded that pain for peace, I would have lost more than my sister. I would have lost myself. Khadgar smiled, and this time the expression held genuine warmth rather than simply understanding. Then you are wiser than most who walk the path of power. Come, let us send you home, Stephen Strange. Your world needs you, and AzeRoth owes you a debt it can never properly repay. They walked together through corridors carved from living stone, past windows that looked out over an ocean that was finally, blessedly free of purple corruption. Strange's legs trembled with each step, but he kept moving, kept pushing forward, because standing still had never been an option he could accept. Khadgar led him to a chamber where arcane energy pooled like water, forming patterns that Strange recognized from his own studies of dimensional travel. The older mage began the casting, his hands moving through gestures that were similar to Kamar Taj's teachings, but different in subtle ways, as if the magic here operated according to slightly different rules. The portal began to form, golden sparks tracing familiar circles in the air. Through the opening, Strange could see the Sanctum Sanctorum, could see Wong standing in the library with a cup of tea and an expression of mild concern that suggested he had noticed Strange's absence, but had trusted him to return when ready. Home. After everything. After all the impossibility and pain and cosmic horror. Strange was going home. Khadgar stepped back from the completed portal, his staff resting easily in his hands. One final warning, if you will permit it. The void has tasted your world now, has felt its structure and mapped its defenses. You close the door, but doors can be reopened. Be vigilant. Be prepared. And remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Strange stepped toward the portal, then paused. He turned back to Khadgar, and for a moment allowed himself to show the exhaustion and fear and bone-deep weariness that he normally kept hidden. If it comes for Earth, if the void tries to use the connection I created, will you help us? Khadgar's expression grew solemn, but he nodded without hesitation. The battles between our worlds are not so separate as most believe. If darkness threatens Earth, it threatens all realities. Yes, Stephen Strange, if the void comes for your world, you will not face it alone. Strange felt something unclench in his chest, some tension he had not fully acknowledged until it was released. He inclined his head in gratitude, too tired for more elaborate thanks, and stepped through the portal. The transition was jarring after days in AzeRoth's strange, arcane environment. The Sanctum's familiar magic wrapped around him like a comfortable coat, and for a moment, Strange simply stood there, breathing in air that smelled like New York and old books and the particular incense Wong preferred for meditation. Wong looked up from his tea, one eyebrow raised. "You look terrible." Strange laughed, the sound slightly unhinged but genuine. "I survived an encounter with entities that predate human civilization, reversed a dimensional invasion, and closed a portal between realities using my own body as an anchor." Terrible seems like an understatement. Wong set down his tea and approached, his practiced eye taking in the blood on Strange's robes, the scar on his forehead, the tremor in his hands that had intensified. "You need medical attention and rest, and probably several weeks of recovery before you do anything more strenuous than paperwork." Strange nodded, swaying slightly. "All of that sounds wonderful. But first, we need to strengthen the Sanctum's defenses. The void knows about Earth now, knows about me. It will be patient, but it will come. We need to be ready." Wong studied him for a long moment, and Strange saw understanding dawn in his friend's eyes. "You brought something back with you. Not physically, but the connection remains." Strange touched his forehead, where the third eye pulsed once in acknowledgement. "Yes, I am marked. A door that can potentially open both ways. I close the channel, but the void remembers. And what the void remembers, it eventually reclaims." Wong poured a second cup of tea and handed it to Strange. "Then we will prepare. We'll strengthen the wards. We'll make certain that when the void comes, if it comes, we are ready to send it back to whatever darkness it crawled from. But for now, you rest. Even heroes need to recover. Strange accepted the tea, letting the warmth seep into his damaged hands. Through the sanctum's windows, he could see New York going about its business. Millions of people living their lives in blissful ignorance of how close they had come to invasion. He had protected them, had sacrificed pieces of himself to ensure their safety. And he would do it again if necessary, would make the same choice every time. Because that was what heroism meant. Not the absence of pain, but the choice to carry it forward. Not the erasure of memory, but the acceptance of what memory taught. Not the rejection of darkness, but the decision to remain human despite its touch. Strange sipped his tea and allowed himself, just for a moment, to feel the weight of what he had endured. The grief for Donna that would never fully heal. The corruption that spread slowly through his being. The knowledge that the void waited somewhere in the spaces between realities, patient and hungry, and certain that eventually he would falter. But he had not faltered yet. Had stood before the darkness and chosen light. Had been offered peace and chosen truth instead. And when the void came again, as he knew it eventually would, he would make the same choice. Would sacrifice what needed to be sacrificed. Would remember what needed to be remembered, because that was what we choose to do. Not forget our pain, but build something worthy upon its foundation. Not erase our failures, but learn from them. Not run from the darkness, but stand against it with the full knowledge that standing might not be enough, but standing was still the only choice that mattered. Strange finished his tea and handed the cup back to Wong. Thank you. For the tea. For trusting me to return. For being here. Wong accepted the cup with a slight smile. That is what friends do. They trust. They wait. They stand ready to help when help is needed. He paused, his expression growing more serious. The void may remember you, Strange. But Earth remembers you too. Remembers what you sacrificed. Remembers that you chose to protect us even when the cost was everything. That memory, that knowledge, is a defense stronger than any ward or spell. It is the memory of heroism. And that is something even the void cannot corrupt. Strange felt tears prick at his eyes, exhaustion and relief and gratitude all mixing together into something too complex for words. He simply nodded, trusting Wong to understand what he could not articulate. Then he walked slowly toward his chambers, each step an effort, his body demanding the rest it had been denied for days. Behind him, he could hear Wong beginning the work of strengthening the sanctum's defenses, practical and efficient and exactly what Strange needed him to be. And deep beneath the surface of thought, in the place where the third eye watched and waited, Strange felt the faintest whisper. Not words, not even fully formed concepts, but presence. The void acknowledging his return, noting his location, remembering him the way he remembered Donna. But Strange did not flinch from that presence, did not try to wall it off or pretend it did not exist. He acknowledged it, accepted it as part of himself now, and chose to carry it forward the same way he carried every other burden he had accumulated. What we choose to remember defines us. And Stephen Strange chose to remember everything. The pain and the triumph, the failures and the victories, the sister who drowned and the hero who sacrificed himself, and the choice to stand against darkness even when standing seemed impossible. He chose to remember, and in remembering, he chose to remain human. And that choice, more than any spell or power or cosmic authority, was what made him a hero worth remembering in return.